With the release of Spider-Man 2 and Super Mario Bros. Wonder, there's been concerns about video game sequels that are better than the original releases. Are modern games playing it too safe? Are modern games really just not made like they used to be? Well, the answer's not that simple. Spider-Man 2 and Super Mario Bros. Wonder are the brand new babies to hit the gaming industry, and they've been getting excellent reviews, and are both probably gonna sell well too. This has been a hell of a year for all sequels too. The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, Alan Wake 2, Pikmin 4, Street Fighter 6, Final Fantasy 16, Resident Evil 4 Remake. The list just goes on. And with that ever-expanding list comes a bunch of opinions from the deepest bowels of the internet. You probably can't go more than 1 minute on any social media without finding some hot take about how video games are terrible and all of the things you like are actually stupid, and you should feel stupid for liking them. Well, I'm not here to do that. Video games are doing better than ever this year, with so many amazing sequels and incredible original games releasing in the indie sphere, like Pseudo-Regalia and Dredge. The list goes on. Despite the trouble in the game dev industry with so many layoffs this year, there's been so many incredible releases. But I've seen some growing concerns about some of the biggest sequels that have released this year, and I wanted to dive more into what some people refer to as the safe sequel. The safe sequel? Well, how can a video game be safe? They're investments that take hundreds of millions of dollars, with teams in the several hundreds, or even thousands, that have a billion ways of going wrong, and basically only one way of going right. Well, development for these games is anything but safe, but a lot of players have been expressing concerns that recent games like Spider-Man 2 play it too safe because of the similarities to the original release back in 2018. Regardless of all the hard work the developers have done to updating the game's systems and technologies, players only get to see the end result, and if the end result doesn't feel different enough, players may not appreciate the work that goes into them. But that doesn't necessarily invalidate player concerns. Not at all. I want to look a bit more into Spider-Man 2, Mario Wonder, and also examine the history of some of the most famous video game sequels. This is going to be impossible to narrow down, since there are so many noteworthy successors that completely overshadow their predecessors and deserve a spot in gaming history, but I want to dive into the most famous sequels and how safe they all played it. Is there a correlation to more successful and famous games taking more risks? Or is this just a recent growing pain that people are starting to feel? It's impossible to narrow down this list. There have been so many influential and important sequels to games over the years, so I'm going to primarily focus this list on some modern games, but also examine the history of some of the most famous sequels ever. Famous in a way that they almost completely overshadow their predecessors. When you think of Street Fighter, you never think of the original. You think of Street Fighter 2, so of course that's going to be on the list. I want to pick at least one game for every 5 years or so, trying to include every different console generation since the NES. So taking everything into consideration, our final list is going to be 12 strong with some extra additions and bonus rounds. We've got Spider-Man 2, Super Mario Bros. 3, and we'll also throw in Super Mario Bros. Wonder for good measure, The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, Red Dead Redemption 2, and a quick look at GTA 5, The Witcher 3, Resident Evil 4, and the remake, the original Street Fighter 2, Portal 2, Mega Man 2, Mass Effect 2, Warcraft 3, and Final Fantasy 7. And we'll do a quick examination of previous entries in the Final Fantasy series as well. Okay, we've got a custom-built, patented, safe for surprise ranker that we'll be tossing each of our games into to determine if it's too safe of a sequel or original enough that it stands with its own identity. This isn't about the game's success or critical ratings. All of these games are highly regarded and sold well, but I want to take a look at all their previous entries and see how different these games actually feel with respect to their series history. Without further ado, let's start at the very beginning with our oldest entry on the list, Super Mario Bros. 3, released in October of 1988, only 1 month after Super Mario Bros. 2, in September, except that's not entirely true. That was the American release of Super Mario Bros. 2, whereas the original Japanese release of Mario Bros. 2, known as The Lost Levels internationally, was in 1986, only 2 years after the previous entry, and Mario Bros. 3 completely blows the series and expectations out of the water, with so many brand new innovations. If Super Mario Bros. 1 walked, Super Mario Bros. 3 traveled at the speed of light. Mario can pick up and carry items to take out enemies, and we've got brand new power-ups, but we've also got a brand new overworld map with new additions, a save feature that lets players continue their progress, unlike the original Super Mario Bros., but the true changes are just in the absolute polish and level design. Super Mario Bros. Is a fun game that completely changed the idea of what home console gaming could be like. And Mario Bros. 2, the Japanese one, was a direct continuation of that idea, but Mario Bros. 3 set the standard for what 2D Mario games would be. It's a monumental release, and you're going to hear me say that a lot through these games. but it's a monumental release that is still considered to be one of the greatest ever made. It's pretty hard to approach it with an objective lens, but when you actually sit down and play the two games side by side, you can feel the difference immediately. Before we evaluate Mario 3, let's take a quick bonus peek into Mario Wonder. It might not look like much at first glance, but for anyone who's a Mario fan, Mario Wonder is an incredible leap from the previous mainline console release of New Super Mario Bros. U. There's so much personality and charm, and the presentation really sells the brand new feeling of Mario Wonder, more so than any of the actual new Super Mario Bros. Games have for a while. It might not look like much of a difference, which is fair. It's pretty difficult to take side-scrolling platforming in bold new directions. But from what I've played, I think Mario Wonder is pretty special. It's much more subtle than the change from Mario Bros. 3, so I wouldn't fault anyone for thinking otherwise. Enough of that, let's toss this bad boy into the machine, and no surprise, our first surprise of the list. We'll do a quick toss of Mario Wonder, and yeah, it's definitely earned its surprise rating. But this one, like Mario Bros. 3, definitely has to be played to feel that originality in its bones. 1 down, 11 to go. Next up, we've got Mega Man 2, a personal favorite of mine, released in December of 1988, 1 year after the original Mega Man, if you're looking at the original Japanese release dates. Mega Man 2 is excellent 2D action platforming that I think is still super playable to this day, and I could recommend it to anyone who doesn't mind a bit of a challenge. The music's excellent, and the standard Mega Man formula of obtaining the weapons of bosses to use against future bosses never gets old. But that formula was firmly represented in the previous and first entry, and it's not the only thing. This is a bit of a recurring thing with future entries in the Mega Man series that were released with the Famicom and NES. But yeah, these games are all pretty visually identical, and they more or less follow the exact same formula. Defeat the 8 robot masters to unlock the final stages in Dr. Wily's castle, and exterminate him. Make him realize the error of his ways. The first Mega Man had some growing pains regarding difficulty spikes and some unfair level design, and Mega Man 2 dialed it in a way that felt polished to near perfection. But when you look at these games side by side, they're pretty identical visually and mechanically. They had many of the same developers too. Mega Man 2 is a great refinement of the foundation that Mega Man put forth, but I think it's fair to say that many see it as the game that Mega Man 1 was trying to be. Toss that into the ranker, and we've got ourselves our first safe. It's a great game, and I love it personally, but it doesn't innovate or try to reinvent the original Mega Man, and I'm glad it doesn't. It's amazing and led to the growth of such an important franchise in gaming history. Next up, Capcom's up to bat again with the one and only, Street Fighter 2. A game so influential that it's credited for defining the fighting game genre as we know it today. It wasn't the first fighting game, but it might as well be. With its complete reinvention of what a fighting game should be, you can't help but feel bad for its older predecessor. The mostly forgotten original, Street Fighter, released a whole 4 years prior in 1987. It's pretty rough, but it actually did have some important features that would be a mainstay for the series, like command inputs for your special moves, as well as the introduction of important franchise protagonists Ryu and Ken. But if you look at the sequel, the differences couldn't be more in your face. The action is much quicker and snappier, the characters and visuals are all so much more vibrant, you have a selection of 8 playable characters rather than just 1, and you have the incredible music by Yoko Shimomura. There isn't much else that can be said about Street Fighter 2. It's truly legendary, and not just a great sequel, but one of the most important games ever made, alongside the original Super Mario Bros. Yeah, I don't even need to toss this one into our ranker, but I'll do it anyway. This is the easiest surprise among probably our entire list. A sequel so incredibly game-changing that it erased its predecessor from the history books. Next, we've got the one and only, Final Fantasy VII, what I would consider to be probably the most well-known JRPG ever made, right behind the original Game Boy Pokemon games. Released in January of 1997, a whole 3 years after the previous mainline entry of Final Fantasy VI, it doesn't take a genius to immediately see the difference in these two games. While Final Fantasy VI is considered a masterpiece and a perfection of the 16-bit era for RPGs, and all of gaming as a whole back then, Final Fantasy VII completely blew things out of the water. And that's partially thanks to its massive popularity in the West, as well as the groundbreaking technology and visuals that were powering FF7 with the release of the original PlayStation. This is a trend that we're going to see with many of our sequels on the list. The influence of new console generations and emerging technologies definitely helped give FF7 a major identity of its own. Even though at the end of the day, it plays like a standard JRPG, there's no major gameplay innovations to be found, aside from some pretty neat minigames that utilize 3D technology. But the inclusion of the third dimension when it came to experiencing the world, alongside the glorious music by Nobuo Uematsu that ascended from what was limited with 16-bit consoles, it's tough to rank this one given its similarities to Final Fantasy VI. But let's see what the ranker says. Oof. It was a tough decision, but I think I agree with Surprise. While Final Fantasy VII didn't make major changes to the traditional gameplay mechanics, its presentation, cinematic visuals, music, and overall influence in the West compared to other RPGs leaves this in the Surprise category, though this one could really fall on either side depending on who you ask. If you were to look at the series history, I'd say that the leap between FF6 and 7 was the biggest of the series up to that point. The first several games were all gradual iterations and improvements, with Final Fantasy IV being a big jump due to the newest console generation. Final Fantasy VI was a perfection of the leap that 4 started, but 7 was an even bigger leap into the future of Final Fantasy as a whole. Whether you agree with it being a surprise or not, the influence that FF7 has had on Square Enix as a company, as well as RPGs in general, cannot be overstated. Next up is a personal favorite of my older brother's, Warcraft 3, Reign of Chaos. Released in July 2002, a whole 7 years after the previous mainline entry with Warcraft 2, Tides of Darkness. The longest gap we've had so far with our sequels, and another big generational gap. Warcraft 3, like every other entry on our list, was a huge release, redefining real-time strategy games for the future, and setting many industry and gameplay standards. I can't speak personally too much on these games, but I think this is another case like Street Fighter 2. I rarely hear anyone talk about Warcraft 1 or 2, and Warcraft 3 was not only influential among its RTS peers, but the online and modding community led to the creation of Dota, which in turn eventually led to Dota 2 and the incredibly popular League of Legends, which is basically inescapable now with its many spin-offs and Netflix series. Not much reason to dwell on this one, let's see where it falls in the ranker. Surprise! But mostly influential? Yeah, it's a bit hard to define this one, since it seems like Warcraft 3 is much more remembered for the foundation it built for other games and properties rather than what it did for itself, but that doesn't discredit the game. However, when you look at the gameplay and mechanics of previous RTS games from Blizzard, it doesn't really reinvent the genre or introduce many groundbreaking additions. So this one's a bit hard to judge. It definitely is a step up in the presentation department, and the single-player campaign is regularly seen as a giant highlight of the presentation and narrative. I think it earns the surprise rating, based on the fact that I almost never hear about Warcraft 1 or 2. But let me know if you disagree with the ranker's judgment. I'd love to hear more from players who've personally played the previous Warcraft games alongside 3. Next up, you probably already know where this one's gonna land.
Resident Evil 4.
The game that's so influential and amazing and popular that you can play it on basically any device created since its original release all the way back in 2005. The previous mainline Resident Evil game was released in 2000 with Code Veronica, and we got a remake of the first game in 2002. The influence of Resident Evil 4 cannot be overstated enough. Rather than following the traditional fixed camera survival horror of the previous games, Resident Evil 4 adopted its own unique camera system that's still a mainstay in so many modern games. An over-the-shoulder perspective that keeps things action-focused, but with the same claustrophobic horror that the series is known for. Not only is there more action, but also the game is much more linear than previous entries, focusing on tight levels from point A to point B, with some room for little bits of exploration. A new inventory management system, a daring and cocky new protagonist, and an entirely different approach to enemies and encounters, Resident Evil 4 is regularly cited as one of the greatest games of all time, and it's a no small feat to its surprise. Yes, I know you were expecting this. Resident Evil 4 is probably one of the biggest departures we've seen so far for a sequel. It very easily earns its surprise rating, probably more so than any other game we'll see on the rest of the list. For a fun bonus round, let's take a look at the Resident Evil 4 remake and compare it to the previous remake of Resident Evil 3. We could compare it to Resident Evil Village, but that's more or less doing its own thing with the continuation of the mainline Resident Evil games. The remakes are following their own path, so it's a fun comparison to see how Resident Evil 4 remake stacks up with Resident Evil 3 remake. It's a well-made game that honors the original while still providing its own flavor and identity. You can see it as a remixed version of Resident Evil 4, but when we compare it to RE3 remake, yeah, this one falls on the safe side. Following the gameplay that's been set forth with the RE2 remake, all three of these feel like the sequential chapters in a bigger story. Don't get me wrong, RE4 remake is doing a lot of great things compared to the previous two, but the influence and originality can't compare with the original release. It's similar gameplay with the same camera, production, flair. If you've played any of RE2 Remake or RE3 Remake, you can jump into RE4 Remake with no trouble at all. They're all great games, but they definitely feel a bit too safe when lumped all together, and not as innovative as some of the mainline Resident Evil games, except maybe 6. I like 6 actually, but that's a whole other T-virus beast. Let's do a brief check-in at the halfway point. Of our 6 main games, we've got 5 surprises and 1 safe. Interesting, although not all that surprising to me. The 80s and 90s were very experimental for video games as a whole, so it makes sense to me that many of our entries so far were all well known for taking big risks and trying new things. What I haven't been mentioning is all of the experimental flops and failures, of which there were so many during this time. But we're well into the awkward angst of the mid-2000s, so let's keep trucking along, starting off with the first entry in the second half of our list. Mass Effect 2, the only game on the list that I've never played, so forgive my inexperience, but I had to include this one. Mass Effect is absolutely huge, or at least it used to be, and it was one of the biggest franchises during the 2000s. It was probably one of the biggest sci-fi video games during this time alongside Halo, and was the next big thing for Western RPGs. It helped put BioWare on the map. The game still functions similarly to its predecessor, Mass Effect 1. Released in 2007, where 3 years later in Mass Effect 2 sought to refine many of the prior elements. While Mass Effect 1 had larger open areas to explore on vehicle, Mass Effect 2 simplified things by focusing on distinct locations instead. Combat, the RPG elements, everything was refined, similar to the approach that Mega Man 2 would take from its predecessor. Some would argue that there was more of a push for action in Mass Effect 2, where the developers wanted to streamline the RPG elements. It wasn't a unanimous favorable opinion, as some fans still prefer the mechanics of the first, but Mass Effect 2 was a huge success and widely seen as an improvement in most regards. I remember the hype and conversation around the game very well. Anyways, the old ranker deems this game safe. Yeah, this doesn't seem too far off of a judgment to me. Mass Effect 2 didn't seek to completely change the game that came before. At the end of the day, it was still an action sci-fi RPG, but it sought to improve on every aspect where the first game was lacking in, and I think it succeeded in that. It wasn't a reinvention, but it was a refinement, exactly like Mega Man 2. Well, just 1 year after that, and we're already at our next entry, Portal 2, released in 2011, 4 years after the original innovative puzzler, Portal. Portal 2 was incredible, introducing new mechanics and a sharply told story, alongside the inclusion of a brand new cooperative mode where you and a buddy would tackle exclusive levels that take full advantage of having 4 portals available. The writing, presentation, and puzzles have aged like fine wine, and I could still easily recommend it to anybody today. Portal 1 was already a wonderful little puzzle game that would run you about 3 to 4 hours, and Portal 2 was a great upgrade with smarter mechanics and funnier writing that would run you about 10 to 15 hours, depending on if you wanted to complete both campaigns. This one's particularly hard for me to properly judge on their reinvention. Portal was already such an amazing game, so there wasn't seemingly that many places to go from there. But Portal 2 defied expectations and is regularly seen as a massive improvement over the first game. But at first glance, it's still just Portal. It's everything a sequel should be, but is it enough to be considered a total surprise? Well, let's see what the ranker says. Both? Yeah, so I would say that Portal 2 can be argued that it plays things a bit safe if you're only considering the single player campaign. The writing is next level and the puzzles are excellent, but you're still venturing through Aperture Labs, interacting with Gladys and learning more about the mysteries of the facility while solving puzzles. The labs have had a lovely rotten makeover, but the familiarity is both a strength and a potential weakness for players who were maybe expecting an entirely different setting and story. However, I think Portal 2 totally exceeds as a surprise when you take into account the incredible co-op campaign. With much more inventive puzzles that truly test the players, working with a buddy also adds to the experience. The social dynamic really adds a nice flavor to the game that works wonderfully with the comedic writing. It regularly insults the players and pits them against each other. It's wonderful and totally earns its surprise rating. So in the end, I'd say that Portal 2 is both safe and a surprise, but neither rating really matters in the end. It's just an incredible game. One more RPG on our list, and we've got what is one of, if not the best-selling RPG of all time, The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. This is a fascinating entry, releasing in May of 2015, 4 years after its predecessor, The Witcher 2: Assassins of Kings. The Witcher 2 was a pretty successful RPG back in the day, reviewing well for its story, RPG mechanics, combat, and environments. The game would go on to sell 1 million copies within its first couple of months, a success for CD Projekt Red. 4 years later, and they would create the triumph that was The Witcher 3, seemingly blowing every other RPG out of the water at the time. With praise towards its multiple branching questlines and narratives, combat, exploration, and world design, The Witcher 3 was monumental. Everything got a massive redesign, from bigger and more interesting environments to explore, to more interesting enemies and combat encounters, to varied storylines and questlines. The Witcher 3 was so successful that it made The Witcher 2 look like child's play. And that's no small feat. The Witcher 2 was a great game, but The Witcher 3 was something else entirely. A beast so large that not even Geralt could slay it. I wasn't personally super huge on the game, but I was nonetheless impressed with it, and I could recommend it to anybody looking for a fun fantasy adventure. This is gonna be an easy one for the ranker. It gets a fat surprise. The team at CD Projekt Red knew exactly what they were doing with The Witcher 3, and despite the technical issues that were present in the game at launch, CD Projekt Red was thrown into the stratosphere of expectations for up-and-coming development teams. Whether you care about the Witcher series or not, you cannot deny the glow-up from the second game to the third game. Flashback to the grand old Wild West, and we ride up on Red Dead Redemption 2, which at the time was one of the most anticipated games in the industry. For years, there were rumors and leaks and conversations regarding what the next big thing would be for Rockstar following the still massive success of Grand Theft Auto 5. GTA 5 was already a pretty big leap from GTA 4, and that leap has only been more apparent with the runaway success of the online mode, which has been flooded with players thanks to the PC modding community. To no big surprise, the next franchise for Rockstar would be a return to the Wild West with Red Dead Redemption 2, released in October of 2018, a whole 8 years after the previous entry, although only 5 years after the release of Rockstar's last big game, GTA 5. Red Dead 2 was an incredibly ambitious game, and the ambition paid off. Multiple Game of the Year awards, perfect scores from dozens of gaming sites and journalists, and high praise among fans too. It still looked on favorably as one of the greatest and most influential games to release during the PS4, Xbox One era. And that's in no small feat to the incredible story and characters, world design, and immersive mechanics that focused on more realistic tasks and management. Red Dead 2 feels like it wanted to immerse you in a way that Red Dead 1 could never. From the visuals to a bunch of realistic management, like how many weapons you can carry, looting bodies, taking care of the protagonist, it would take forever to list all of the different additions that Red Dead 2 brings to Rockstar's open world formula. And I would say it paid off. Despite some player grievances towards the shift for more realistic mechanics instead of player freedom or enjoyment, Red Dead 2 was a resounding success, critically and financially. Red Dead 1 is looked back on favorably, but I think you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone that prefers the gameplay, world, or narrative of the previous entry in this series. Let's see where it falls in the old ranker. And no surprise with that one. Of course it's a surprise. Even though some parts of the map from Red Dead 1 were reused alongside some older mechanics, everything was rebuilt from the ground up for this world and these characters. Even the shared parts of Red Dead 1's map received a massive glow up, making them almost unrecognizable. Red Dead 2 was bigger than the first game in every way, and it paid off for them. Now here we are in the year of our Lord Gaben 2023, and we've got the direct and rare sequel to one of the most lauded games in the past 10 years. The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom released to incredible reviews that confirmed that the sequel seemingly did the impossible, which was meet the standards that were set forth by Breath of the Wild in 2017. Direct sequels in the Zelda franchise are very rare. Usually Nintendo takes a complete from-the-ground-up approach with any new entry, redoing the world design, art style, gameplay mechanics. They typically stick to the normal Zelda traditions of collecting items to explore dungeons in the world, but everything surrounding that formula is usually rebuilt from scratch. With Tears of the Kingdom, Nintendo opted to take what they liked from Breath of the Wild and completely expand on that concept. Literally. The world's now been expanded to include explorable regions in the sky, as well as an entire overworld located underground that's a near comparable size to the regular surface world. Not only that, but they created some wild mechanics that let you interact and approach exploring the world in a way that would have never been possible in Breath of the Wild. You're not just using your paraglider and climbing to explore the world. You're building whatever contraption you can think of, no matter how dumb it is. You're diving from the sky and surveying the land before plummeting all the way to the depths, using light sources to explore the dangerous enemy encampments and unique underground bosses. That imagination and creativity is felt everywhere you go in Tears of the Kingdom. There's just one little caveat. Yeah, you're still more or less doing the same things you did in Breath of the Wild. The new mechanics and explorable sky and underground locations do add a lot of variety to a world you thought you knew, but the thing is, you do already know this world, especially if you've played a lot of Breath of the Wild. I would say that at least 70% of your time playing Tears of the Kingdom is still spent on the largely familiar surface of Hyrule. I wasn't discovering brand new locations like in the previous game. I was revisiting old locations that had some changes to them, some of them large, some of them barely noticeable, but I was doing it with a brand new perspective. I wouldn't think to just climb the highest location to get a lay of the land like I did in Breath of the Wild. I would approach the world from the sky, diving in on a crazy contraption that barely functioned and seeing the world I already knew from a brand new perspective. But it was still the same world. The closest thing I can compare this with is revisiting your hometown after you've had some crazy new vision surgery, so you can see so much more clearly. And now you're older, so you have a brand new perspective on certain things. Some of your favorite shops have stayed open, and there's plenty of new ones, but in the end, it's still your hometown. You know more or less the layout of the town, despite some fun shakeups. And that's what Tears of the Kingdom was for me. A wonderful revisit to a world I already loved, with some new reasons to fall in love with it all over again. But the excitement in Tears was much more about the incredible new gameplay mechanics, rather than exploring Hyrule again. Even the inclusion of the Sky Islands and the depths aren't interesting enough to stand on their own, but the groundbreaking, and I really can't emphasize this enough, groundbreaking mechanics completely worked for me, but they didn't for everyone, and I know some people were disappointed that the world felt a bit too samey. Honestly, this is hard to rank. Let's see where the ranker is gonna place this. Ooh, Yeah, I'm not surprised it broke. I think most people would say that Tears of the Kingdom is innovative, and I would be on that side. But I wouldn't fault anyone at all who feels disappointed by it. It's a game that had one specific goal in mind, and if that goal doesn't work for you, then the whole thing might just crumble apart. Honestly, I'm glad that Tears of the Kingdom took the approach it did. Rather than just creating a new basic world to explore the same way you did the previous one, it gave you incredible new tools to re-explore the familiar world in a way that made it feel new. And I don't think I could go back to Breath of the Wild after the fact. I'll miss my hover bike and my stupid car that I built using only rocks and wheels, but for some people the new mechanics just didn't click with them, and probably felt a bit too cumbersome and demanding to really get your worth from them. I was ready to meet that demand because the reward and discovery felt completely worth it to me, but hey, it doesn't work for everyone. That's not to mention all the issues with Breath of the Wild that weren't addressed with Tears of the Kingdom, such as frustrating mechanics and a lack of meaningful narrative. So in the end, I'm gonna say this falls under the same ranking that Portal 2 does. It's both a surprise and safe, and this one honestly just depends on who you ask. But for my money, this game is really special, and if you haven't tried it out yet, I hope it has the same effect on you that it did on me. Moving on to our 12th and final entry, aka our most recent entry, alongside Mario Wonder, we have the one and only Spider-Man 2. The previous main entry for this series originally released in 2018, with a smaller standalone game releasing in 2020, and this game definitely lives up to its title. We're back again with Peter Parker, and now we've got Miles Morales, acting as a complete second playable character to Peter Parker. It's not just Spider-Man plus Miles Morales, they've got equal footing and equal relevance to this story and game, and it's a great feature. Switching back and forth between Peter and Miles on the fly thanks to the weird magic of the PS5 SSD, taking on brand new villains villains that are invading New York and dealing with more personal Spider-Man drama, it's basically everything you could expect from a sequel. And the city has been increased to include more explorable areas. Neat. But this sequel is everything you would expect and also seemingly not much more. From what I've heard from the old internet grapevine and from what I've played myself, this game is a continuation of the formula established by the previous two entries, but it ain't looking to reinvent the wheel. Just fine-tune it with as many sweet mods and tricks as the wheel can fit. But at the end of the day, the combat is mostly the same, with a focus on abilities and the addition of a new parry. The web swinging and exploring is pretty similar, with some neat new web wings and extra tricks to launch you around the city. And the story is another Spider-Man fights villains and deals with personal life issues because that's what Spider-Man do. For some players, that's great. The first game from 2018 was incredible, and I think everyone really just wanted more but better. And this game does seem to deliver. And there's a lot of new impressive technological improvements that I think deserve some more praise, like the greatly improved lighting and pedestrian density in the city that makes it feel much more alive. But if you've played Spider-Man 1 from 2018, then you know what to expect with this. I've also heard some sentiments saying that they wish the story was a bit more surprising, and that if you know anything about Spider-Man lore, you can already predict where the story was going. I can't speak on this myself, although I would argue that the previous game had some of the same predictability going on too, at least with certain character arcs. But hey, enough of that. Thank God we've got an expert technician who fixed up our rancor. Let's see what Spider-Man 2 gets. Yeah, I think that's fair. While the game isn't a reinvention of the previous games, it does do a lot of improvements and refinement. The one thing that's worth mentioning is the previous main game only released in 2018, which was 5 years ago, whereas the smaller standalone game only released in 2020, just 3 years ago. Keep in mind, this standalone game will still run you about 15 hours if you're going for full completion. Not to mention that the developers also released Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart in 2021. No clue what the developers at Insomniac are snorting, but I think the safe rating is fair for Spider-Man 2, but also still an impressive feat that the developers could release so many great games in such a small amount of time. So there we have it. All of our games ranked as either safe or surprise. And what have we learned? Yeah, that checks out. Yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't really say that there's been a trend for modern game sequels playing it too safe, though I can understand where that sentiment's coming from. I think it feels that way, sure, but one thing that's important to consider is that the 80s and 90s were really the Wild West for games. So a lot of developers and companies were throwing so many ideas on the wall to see what would stick, and sometimes it would take a miracle for the stick to actually stick, you know what I mean? I think it's fair to want something new and innovative along with something comfortable and reliable, but games are becoming so unbelievably expensive these days, one flop could totally sink a studio. Just look at Volition with the recent Saints Row reboot. It doesn't surprise me to see less risky games these days. I think it's safe to say that there really is no winning trick with a video game regarding how much it takes risks or doesn't. What really matters is the quality and time spent on a game. Sometimes more of the same is exactly what audiences want, but I do think there's a perfect balance that can be tricky to get right, since everyone has different tastes. Regardless of a game's more risky or more safe, it doesn't change the fact that all of these games on this list were successful for their own reasons, and they deserve to be celebrated. Anyways, Nintendo, enough of this baby-safe Mario platforming. We're ready for Yoshi to